Lecture 9-2, Inflation. In the first half of Lecture 9, we covered how money is created and how the money supply grows or contracts. So the next question is why we should care about that. And these pictures answer that question in one word. Inflation. Your first impression might be that having more money has to be a good thing. There's an old saying that you can never be too thin or have too much money, which turns out to be wrong on both counts. The too much money part, especially when we're talking about the economy as a whole, rather than the income of an individual. As a general rule of thumb, we'd like the money supply to grow at the same rate as the production or output of the economy, to create an environment of price stability and to reduce uncertainty about the future. Think back to the ideas we've developed throughout these lectures. We've started with the contention that economic growth is the path to wealth, and we identified the institutions that are associated with economic growth. We looked at the role entrepreneurs play in markets and pointed out that they must choose to accept risk. Obviously, their willingness to do so is enhanced by stability and is reduced by uncertainty. Inflation produces uncertainty in capital letters. It's a serious economic problem, and most economists believe that it's tied to the money supply. Inflation is a general increase in the level of prices. Now, note that this is not the same thing as an increase in the price of this good or that good. The relative prices of various goods and services change all the time, with the conditions of supply and demand in the market. Prices going up for some and down for others as the economy changes. Inflation describes the price level, the prices of all goods and services increasing. And in order for that to happen, there has to be more money in the economy. Think of money as chasing after goods and services. If we produce more goods, we also have to create more money to keep prices stable. Here's a really oversimplified example. Imagine a minuscule economy that only produces one donut and has a money supply of 10 cents. The donut sells for 10 cents. If the economy grows and produces 2 donuts, in order for donuts to continue to sell for 10 cents, the money supply of our mini economy must increase to 20 cents. And this is where, if you remember, the Fed comes in. What if the Fed increases the money supply to 50 cents and there are still only 2 donuts to buy? Right, the price will go up to 25 cents a donut. But a donut is still a donut is still a donut. Sustained periods of inflation occur when the money supply increases faster than the output of goods and services. Now, this might seem like it's no big deal. So the producers can charge higher prices. Then they have more money to spend, they should be happy, and they can pay their workers more too. But remember that the things the producers are buying are also increasing in price, as are the goods and services workers are buying. They're not happy, unless their wages are rising at the same rate as inflation, and history tells us that while that might happen for a while, the wages don't keep up. It's kind of like running in place or even going backward. You continue to work hard at your job, but you can't buy as much this year as you did last year because the prices are going up. You get poorer by working. Not good. The primary effect of inflation is to erode purchasing power. It's like the dollar shrinks in value. Each dollar purchases less than it did before. The most common measure of inflation is the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, compiled by the Department of Labor's Bureau of Statistics. The CPI is calculated from the changing prices of the items in a so-called market basket of goods and services that consumers commonly buy. The Bureau of Statistics compares the price of the basket in the current year to the price in a chosen base year. The equation for the CPI is current price divided by base year price times 100. Notice that if the base year is the current year, The top and bottom prices in the equation are the same, so the index is 100. Knowing that the base year equals 100 then, we look for how the index of the current year changes from 100. So let's suppose that the index this year is 125. That means that since the base year, the index has increased 25 points. Prices have increased overall by 25%. The 25% change in the index is referred to as the inflation rate. Is 25% good or bad? Well, that depends on how long it's been since the base year. Inflation of 2 to 3% is considered normal. So if the 25% change took place over 10 years, inflation is low. No problem. But what if the 25% increase took place over 3 years? Inflation of over 8% a year? That's not a good thing. You'd have to get an 8% raise every year just to keep your lifestyle the way it was. Like that's going to happen. This is the running in place analogy we mentioned earlier. We need to point out that while lots of time and effort are spent calculating inflation, it's not an exact science. You only need to look at your own lifestyle to convince yourself that, first, the market basket of goods and services that we bought in 1990 looks very different than the basket we've purchased this year. So, clearly there are discrepancies. Nonetheless, the CPI is still the most reliable indicator that we have. Our fear of inflation is based on historical experience of its effects and alterations in people's behavior. Inflation encourages people to spend rather than save, and it erodes the value of savings accounts. A month ago, the $2,000 you saved was enough for a new computer. A month later, the price tag's $2,200. Your savings account used to be worth a computer, and now it's not. Makes you not want to save, doesn't it? Right, I'm with you. Pull out the credit card and buy it now. Problem is that savings is vital to investment and economic growth, so discouraging savings is definitely not a good thing. Now, think about people living on fixed incomes. They suffer a lot during inflation. Same apartment, same food, same car, but rent, meals, and gas are more highly priced. Lenders don't like inflation any more than savers. When there's unexpected inflation, lenders are repaid with dollars that buy less than the dollars they loaned. When there's sustained inflation, interest rates rise as lenders try to protect themselves, and higher interest rates mean less borrowing and less investment. Meanwhile, the inflation's putting upward pressure on wages and strengthening workers' incentive to spend and accumulate debt. This additional spending just makes the rising spiral of prices and wages worse. For investors, inflation creates additional uncertainty, so business activity tends to fall off. Scholarship over the past couple decades has left few economists with any doubt. Inflation occurs as a result of rapid increases in the money supply. Let me say that again for emphasis. The basic cause of inflation is too rapid expansion of the money supply. Historic data confirms that when there have been rapid increases in the money supply, they've been followed by rapid increases in the price level. You may remember that in the United States, control of the money supply is the responsibility of the Fed. When the Fed's successful, prices stay stable and we don't suffer the effects of inflation. Most other developed countries also have institutions comparable to the Fed, central banks that bear this responsibility for managing the money supply. In many developing countries, however, central banks are weak or non-existent, and the money supply may be manipulated to serve the purposes of those in power. The hyperinflation of Zimbabwe or post-World War I Germany were essentially the result of government financing its own spending by printing money. This lack of monetary freedom and monetary stability plagues many of the kleptocracies of Africa and Asia today, and it's a major barrier to economic growth. Remember, the three functions of money are, first, it's a medium of exchange, and inflation discourages the use of money and people revert back to bartering. Money's supposed to be a standard of value. If prices are constantly changing in an inflation, the signals about the relative scarcities of resources, goods, and services are unreliable. And last, money's supposed to be a store of value, but if prices are rising rapidly, the value of today's dollar is less than yesterday's. In fact, during hyperinflation, like in the pictures we've shown, currency may be worth less in the afternoon than it was in the morning. During the German hyperinflation, factory workers were paid twice a day, and they ran to the factory entrance to give their wages to their wives, who hurried to buy food for the evening meal before prices went up again. While our major concern is with inflation, we should mention that the opposite condition, deflation, is also undesirable. Deflation is rare and it doesn't get as much attention as inflation, but it does occur and it can have devastating effects, as evidenced by the struggles of the Japanese economy over the first part of this century. It's not only a problem when the money supply expands too rapidly, but when it expands too slowly. If there are more products to sell and the same amount of money to buy them, prices have to fall. But remember that producers have already paid the old higher prices for the resources to make the products. If the deflated prices don't cover their costs, and they're not likely to do so in a competitive market, the producer gets squeezed in the middle. Businesses fail, workers lose their jobs, and spending falls farther. Deflation can spiral downward just as inflation spirals up. So the Fed needs to walk a fairly tight rope in its management of the money supply, holding inflation down while at the same time offering business a clear view of the future and enough money in the system to keep interest rates low enough to encourage investment in the creation of new products and new jobs. To be sure, there's ongoing debate about how well the Fed discharges its duties, and even over whether we would be better off without the Fed. We'll provide some readings on those topics in the lesson. As we leave this topic, let's highlight the key points on money, banking, and inflation. First, money's an innovation, and it boosts the wealth-creating power of markets by reducing the costs of exchange. Money's created by the lending operations of commercial banks. Inflation, an increase in the general price level of an economy, results from the money supply growing faster than production. Fourth, inflation creates incentives for consumers and producers to act in ways that disrupt economic growth. And finally, in the United States, the Federal Reserve System is responsible for managing the money supply to prevent inflation and encourage economic growth. This is the end of Lecture 9-2. Please check the lesson guide and submit your assignments before returning to the lecture on Topic 10, International Markets.